Welcome back. I'm sure many of you have seen my first video on the rules of chess, and that we talked about the pieces, we talked about what the objective are, we talked about all the rules that govern chess. Now in this video, I figured it was a good idea to teach on the pieces a little bit more in detail, a little bit more specifically, and talk mostly about their relative value to each other and to the whole game as a whole, because each piece definitely has its advantages and disadvantages when it comes to chess. We're going to go ahead and talk about all of that today. Each of the 6 chess pieces that I have here displayed on the screen, each of the chess pieces have their own sort of relative value, and we're going to base that value off of the lowest common denominator of all of them, and we're going to base it off of the pawn. The pawn itself is worth 1. Okay, so that's just sort of the base. That's just sort of what we're going to start with. The pawn is worth 1 pawn. Okay, that's sort of a duh. Each of the other pieces are going to be measured in value in relation to the pawn itself. So the pawn is worth 1 point. Out of the rest of the pieces, the knight and the bishop are actually both worth 3 points. What's interesting is, and we talked about in the previous videos, is that even though the bishop's a long-range piece, because he is sort of stuck on the same color that he always moves on, the bishop has its limitations. In theory, the bishop cannot cover the entire board. He can only defend half the board, right? Whereas the knight can technically defend the entire board, but it's just a slow-moving piece. So the bishop and the knight in relation to each other are actually both worth 3 pawns each. Now let's talk about the rook. The rook is definitely a better, stronger piece than the bishop and the knight. The rook is actually worth 5 points of material. So the rook is worth 5 pawns. So the reason for that is because even though we talked about that the bishops and the rooks are opposite of each other in the sense that they have opposite move sets, the rook is actually considered to be a much better piece than the bishop because the rook can cover the entire board. Obviously not all at once, but the rook has the potential to cover every square. Since the bishop can only move diagonally, this bishop, for example, is going to stay on the light squares the entire game, whereas the rook can technically go on any color square and theoretically defend the entire board. The queen, we mentioned in the first video, the queen is the second most important piece, but she is the single most powerful piece. And the reason for that is because she was the combination of the rook and the bishop. So the rook and the bishop, you would think, okay, so if the rook is 5 and the bishop is 3, then the queen must be worth 8. Well, the queen is actually worth 9. I guess it's more of a kind of a synergy thing. If one bull can pull 10 pounds of weight and you put 2 bulls together, they can actually do more than 20. They can actually do like 30, right? So it's just more of a synergy effect with the queen. Even though she's a fusion between the 2 of them, she's actually worth just a little bit more than both of them combined. The king is actually worth infinite. The king is actually an infinite piece. He actually doesn't really have like a numerical value, just because if you lose him, you lose the game. Now, with the pieces and their values, you might be asking, well, what the heck does this have to do with anything? Sure, some pieces are better than others in their abilities, but where does the value, where does these numbers that I've addressed and I've assigned to them, where do these numbers come into play? Is it when you finish a chess game, whoever has more points wins? Well, no, we discuss you win by checkmating your opponent. You could have 20 points of material and your opponent only has 5, but they could still checkmate you with those 5, right? So the values that we assign the pieces are more of sort of like guidelines to playing. If you have the opportunity to use your pawn and take out the opponent's queen, well, you should totally do that because you're gaining material you're giving up a pawn, but you're gaining a queen for it. Like, that's definitely like the best trade you can ever have. So why would you not want to do that? So we're going to run through some examples of what this might look like over the board as far as like how values of the pieces sort of come into play. So in this example, this was actually a game that I had played in a tournament where I had made a pretty bad mistake. It wasn't checkmate or anything like that, but I'm definitely going to be down material. I'm playing with the white pieces. So my queen was previously here, and I just slid her over to the e2 square. My opponent went ahead and saw, you know what? I can put the bishop here, and the queen is now going to have to move because if my opponent's thinking if I put the bishop here, well, if I take it, then the knight's going to come back over here and take the queen. So white, which is me in this case, white is going to be losing the queen and only gaining a bishop. So if you're losing the queen, you lose 9 points of material. and I'm gaining a bishop, which is 3. So it nets to be 6 points of material that I'm losing. So I don't want to lose 6 points of material. I don't want to lose my queen to just a bishop. That's really bad. So I have to come up with something else. So what are some alternative moves to this? How can I save my queen and sort of progress with the game? Well, there's really not a whole lot of options. I ended up moving my queen just back to her original square. But the problem is that by moving the queen out of the way, the bishop is now targeting the rook. Now, we talked about rooks are worth 5, and bishops are only 3. So even though my queen's going to step out of the way, and even though this rook is defended by the king, by the queen, black is still going to just take it anyway because it's worth it. And because if you were to progress this game into the future, black should win in most situations, unless they just make terrible mistakes the rest of the game. But black should win because now that I lost a rook to his bishop, he's up 2 points in material. So I still had to move the queen out of the way because I'd rather be down 2 points than 6, right? I'm still not doing great, but I can still play on and I can still keep playing the game even though I'm down in material. Another example of the reason why being down material in many chess games is usually a bad thing is because in a position like this that you see on the board, this was a different game of mine, but this time I was playing with the black pieces. So in this case, black is moving and marching their pawns this way. So I'm hoping to promote a pawn and get a queen. Because I have a rook and he has a knight, this is where, especially near the end of the game like this is where the relative piece values start to really show and to really shine. Because from here, since I have the extra rook to his knight, and I even have some extra pawns as well, my rook is more valuable than the knight because of his ability to do more than the knight can. The knight's a very short range piece and he can only control so many squares at once. At most, he can only control 8, whereas this rook is controlling way more than that. And this rook is supporting these pawns as they march forward. If you have the opportunity in any chess game to exchange a lower valued piece for a higher valued piece, 9 times out of 10, you should do it. So sometimes, even though the values of the pieces do matter, a lot of times it's not always a good idea, for example, to say, oh, this piece is more valuable, so I shouldn't give it up. I shouldn't be down material. Because again, being up or being down in material, being up a pawn or 2 or being down a pawn or 2, or even more than that, doesn't really matter. Sometimes being down in material, you can still win the game. And sometimes you can give up even more material in order to get a win. Like in this example here, you can see on the board, it's white's turn, and white actually has a checkmate in 2 moves. And so the only way to achieve it, though, is that you have to basically give up this queen and put her at the end here and give a check. So even though you're giving up the queen for a rook, it's like, why would you do that? But if you do it and you give a check, he's forced to capture because the king can't get out of the way. And then you can just deliver a checkmate at the very end here anyway. So this is a situation where it's a very good idea to give up material in order to get a win. So again, use the point system that we talked about with each of the pieces. Use those as more of a guideline, necessarily a rule, because there are times where it's definitely a good idea to give up material in order to achieve a checkmate, like in this example. Whenever you see the opportunity to exchange a less valuable piece of yours for a more valuable piece, then do it. It's a great idea. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. See you next time.